This month, true crime takes center stage as Madison Opera presents the world premiere of Everlasting Fate by Madison composer Scott Gendel. Based on the true story of the 1897 Greenbrier ghost, Everlasting Fate is a ghost story, a thrilling drama, and an all-American opera. Don't miss your chance to see it on February 13th and 15th in the Capitol Theater. Tickets at madisonopera.org. Want to win the Madison Summer Camp Rush? Behold Wonder Palette Camp. The local creative art camp in Middleton at Sauk Trail Elementary is open for registration. Campers ages 6 to 12 will find an energetic and supportive environment to explore their creative passions. They offer 4 separate weeks of camp, each unique, and each week has 4 days of fun in the culinary arts, arts and crafts, theater, and dance. Register today at wonderpaletecamp.com. This is CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Today, Madison, whether you like it or not, you're being watched, and now in a way you might not even be aware of. There are more than 80 license plate reading cameras in the Madison area. The technology, colloquially known as flock cams, is made by Atlanta-based Flock Safety. So what's the deal here? Joining me to break down what these cameras mean for public safety and privacy is ACLU Wisconsin policy analyst John McCrae-Jones, who recently wrote about the issue for the ACLU. So John, welcome to CityCast Madison.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Yeah, it's starting to be something I'm hearing in conversations and whispers and people talking about flock cameras. People are really getting interested in this. They've been around Dane County at least for a few years now. I've seen them around. John, can you tell us before we get deep, what are these cameras and basically how are they being used?
So the way that flock is normally described is a license plate reader. And how people imagine that is little cameras that when your car drives by, it reads your license plate. But flock systems go far beyond that. Flock systems just don't read plates. They record a vehicle's make, model, color, dent, bumper stickers, which we can talk about the political consequences of that, and even visible occupants. It basically creates either like a facial ID or a digital fingerprint of your car. And because cars are how most Americans get to and from work and through all their travels, our primary form of transportation, it basically creates a log of wherever Americans go. For example, in Norfolk, Virginia, a U.S. military veteran named Lee Schmidt discovered that his license plate has been logged over 526 times over several months by a network of ALPR cameras. He wasn't under any investigations or suspected of wrongdoings. It was just a part of his daily life that he was being tracked by Norfolk PD.
Well, so I read, at least for those in Dane County that are not in Madison, which we're going to talk about, that they're not collecting video of the person, but rather targeted license plate details, but can get cars going up to 75 to 80 miles per hour. It sounds like you're saying they're collecting much more than that, like all these details about the car that could help identify someone. Is there any talk about whether faces are being identified from these flock cams?
So while the cameras can pick up faces, even pedestrians who are walking by when it takes the picture of the car, we haven't heard anything about facial recognition being integrated with flock cameras or automated license plate readers, ALPRs. That doesn't mean that it can't happen in the future. And also, if you have the camera systems already there, why not integrate it with a facial recognition software? Why not put a second facial recognition technology nearby or on the same pole that the flock cameras are listed? I can already hear the arguments for public safety now of, well, there's a stolen car and we need to identify the person who's driving the car. So why not just add facial recognition? And you can see how this sprawls. And then now not only is every American or every Wisconsinite's car being tracked that's driving to and from work, they're also being tracked through facial recognition when it sees to the dashboard.
And so obviously you're pointing out hey, we have this technology and it's not neutral, that there is potential for misuse. That's what you've been writing about. That's what you've already are setting up. For some context for our listeners, we know that the Madison Police Department does not have flock cameras in use currently, but other departments around and even in Madison do use this technology. There are cameras in Cottage Grove, Maple Bluff, Middleton, Monona, Sun Prairie, on the UW-Madison campus, and on the Capitol Square by the Capitol. There's certainly cameras that I've seen and thinking, like, what is going on here? Do you have a sense of how much usage these flock cameras have, like, across the state of Wisconsin? Like, how prevalent is this?
Thanks to the amazing reporting done by Isaiah Holmes at the Wisconsin Examiner, we do have a little bit of information about flock cameras in Wisconsin. At the minimum, 221 Wisconsin law enforcement agencies are using flock cameras across the state, including Milwaukee County, Wauwatosa, and even a lot smaller county and city police forces. The most common search term in flock wasn't homicide or carjacking. It was simply the term investigation, which is a problem for meaningful oversight because we don't know what investigation means. It's a one-word term used to justify a search of someone's license plates, of where this person has been, where they're going, and law enforcement is not giving us transparency we need in the description to know why are you searching this person's location. Are they using it to help ICE or immigration track down migrants in our community? There's a long history that I can get into of law enforcement officers using flock cameras to track the locations of their wives, their ex-girlfriends, their ex-partners, families, and friends. So you see the issue here of the most common term being used is investigation. We don't know if this is actually being used to stop crime or even investigate crime at all, or if this is used for civil immigration reasons, if it's being used to track people for personal abuse, for personal reasons, which is abuse of power, or even in Texas, where they tapped into the national database and used license plate information from the state of Washington and the state of Illinois during a case where they're investigating a woman for using an abortion. So we don't know if law enforcement agencies are doing that to help other law enforcement agencies in other states prosecute someone for breaking an abortion law or a law surrounding gender-affirming care.
Right. So there are so many considerations that are going into this and how its potential misuse can go down. I just want to establish that the city of Madison has resisted this specific technology for now. This is due in part to the city's updated surveillance technology ordinance, which requires MPD to get approval from the city council, mayor, and IT department before pursuing and installing new equipment. So there's a pause in Madison specifically, except for a couple of areas. That said, as I established, the flock cameras have been placed all around the county and in our surrounding areas. So if you drive out of Madison, you will likely be passing a flock camera. That's why we're talking about it. And you know, you mentioned some of the cons here. Before we get deep into the cons, I do want to just talk briefly about what are the pros, if there are any pros? Like, why are some police departments and communities in favor of their use? What are they saying?
There is an argument for search and rescue and kidnapping cases, where if you do have the car identified, say a child is kidnapped, you can ping the location as the car drives past the different flock cameras. Same thing with search and rescue. If there's an emergency, as much location data you have on people who could possibly be danger or in the area of a potential disaster is beneficial. We can admit that. I think that the cons still outweigh the positives, and that's not what the technology is primarily being used for once it gets in the hands of police departments, if that makes sense.
Sure, yeah, definitely. I was curious about what positives would there be for civilians? Like, is this footage helpful for hit and run accidents? I saw some things about stolen vehicle recovery. But you're saying, and this is for the broader publicly owned police cameras too, you've found and reported on an alarming trend of clear misuse cases. You actually mentioned it already, but officers using surveillance cameras to surveil in their own personal life. The piece that you wrote for the ACLU is titled "Police Surveillance is Ripe for Abuse," with the subheading "Greenfield Police Chief Allegedly Weaponizes Surveillance Camera in Divorce." So Greenfield, Wisconsin, that's over by Milwaukee, their police chief, Jay Johnson, is facing felony misconduct charges, right?
Basically, that law enforcement officer used public cameras, installed them at his private residency, and used it to surveil his private home during a divorce procedure that he was having with his wife. It does make you go, you're installing cameras to watch your home. That happens to happen while you're going through a divorce procedure. Are you looking to gather information about things that could possibly help you in this situation, in this case? Are you possibly surveilling your wife? We don't know. We're not claiming that he did. But again, it's the misuse of taking a public surveillance camera and use it for a private purpose, even though he was advised not to by supervisors and other officials in the city. Another case in Sedgwick, Kansas, you have the police chief, Lee Nygaard. He used his department flock cameras to track his ex-girlfriend's vehicle 164 times, her new boyfriend's car 64 times over just a 4-month period, logging hundreds of search labeled with misleading justifications, like missing child or drug investigation. He even used his police vehicle to follow them outside of town before he ultimately resigned when the misconduct surfaced. In the Wichita area, we have Lieutenant Victor Heyer, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He used flock cameras to stalk his wife. In Georgia, you have Police Chief Michael Steffman. He was arrested on multiple charges, including stalking, harassment, and misuse of automated license plate readers after allegations that he exploited his access to the system to track and harass his ex-partner, their friends and family, and other random individuals. And the one thing in common is that all these misuses by law enforcement of public surveillance technology used for private reasons were against people who weren't being investigated, charged, or suspected of any crimes. These were innocent civilians that basically law enforcement used the tools of a god to abuse, harass, and stalk them. And that's the problem with going back to the single search investigations that we see across the state of Wisconsin. We don't know what these law enforcement officers are searching on these flock cameras. We don't know who they're searching, who they're stalking, who they're harassing. And I truthfully believe that most law enforcement officers are not abusing the technology. But when you have tens of thousands of searches going on, you only need 1 or 2% to be in bad faith to have a massive problem with a lot of potential victims.
So those misuse instances are stark and alarming. Obviously, there are general privacy concerns. What are the other arguments against flock technology? Does over-policing come up as an issue? What other concerns are there?
A big problem is data sharing, especially with federal agencies. Federal agencies can request through local department or network connections information about automated license plate readers. So we're talking about Border Patrol, ICE, and different federal agencies like DHS. And as we're watching the real-time abuse of migrants in our community, this has real impacts on innocent people of law enforcement overusing surveillance technology to surgically target people in our community that has not been charged with any crime and should be innocent until proven guilty. And then watching the full force of the federal government come on top of them due to this information sharing from flock camera networks and different law enforcement agencies.
I am curious, does Wisconsin state law say anything about flock camera use and data storage, and what are the concerns surrounding this kind of data storage?
We really don't have any state laws about data sharing. And that doesn't stop it. Illinois does have a state law about data sharing with federal agencies. Flock shared information anyways. They broke state law. Individual law enforcement agencies and individual officers allegedly also just ran searches for DHS and ICE and Border Patrol, and then shared that information with federal agencies to assist in enforcing immigration law. So even if you do have state laws protecting data sharing, it's hard to actually enforce it and manage it. And the best way to not have that data be shared is to not collect the data in the first place.
Looking for a bucket list winter experience? Head to the Frozen Assets Run, Walk, and Festival. The event runs from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Saturday, February 7th, and brings true winter fun to the Edgewater and frozen Lake Mendota. The celebration is a free, family-friendly, accessible winter extravaganza with fun on the ice, inside the Edgewater Hotel, and outside on the plaza. Plus, thanks to an accessible ramp from the pier to the ice, more people can take part in the magic of being out on the frozen lake. You can also join the Frozen Assets Run Walk. It's one of the only races in the world held entirely on a frozen lake. Proceeds from the Run Walk support Clean Lakes Alliance's work to protect and restore our lakes and inspire community stewardship. New this year, participants get a Frozen Assets stocking cap while supplies last. I heard they're really cute. Learn more and register today at cleanlakesalliance.org/frozen-assets. That's cleanlakesalliance.org/frozen-assets. When we're talking about this issue of privacy, I can't help but think about what's been happening in the Twin Cities the last few weeks. Can you talk about the footage from these cameras in terms of what we know about how they've been used by federal agents for immigration enforcement?
Basically, it allows the government to surgically target where a person has been or their normal routes and where they're going to be. Most people follow a daily routine. If I tracked you for a couple weeks, this is when you leave for work, this is when you come home, this is normally when you go to the grocery store, this is when you normally run other errands, I know where you're going to be. I can surgically and efficiently target you. And that allows people to do the scale of mass raids and mass deportation efforts efficiently if you don't have to go through the struggle of investigation purposes and waiting for someone to be somewhere that is easily accessible without you knowing that they're going to be there. It makes immigration enforcement a lot easier when it can just surveil groups of people, know where they're going to be at a time, hit that spot, pick them up, and disappear. Right now, ICE is investing in hundreds of millions of dollars in surveillance technology, which proves that their mission can't be accomplished without these tools, without working with corporations like Flock.
And I should say for Dane County here, the Dane County Sheriff has an agreement to share information with multiple local law enforcement agencies, but does not share the data with federal agencies. That said, the agreement does not limit how its partners share the data. So 11 of 13 Wisconsin county sheriff's offices have partnered with ICE, per the Wisconsin Examiner. This moment is really a very scary one, and what you're describing throughout the conversation is quite alarming. Is there any sense of, like, is this happening to protesters exercising their First Amendment right? Are they being targeted by ICE through Flock cameras? Like, is it everyone and anyone? I've heard a little bit, but curious what you've heard.
So what we know is that ICE is using social media surveillance to track who is saying what about them and using facial recognition technologies to identify people who are standing up for their communities and using their First Amendment right. We know that different surveillance technologies was weaponized against the pro-Palestine movement on college campuses, and that facial recognition technology was integrated with social media scanning to identify who went to protest Also, different technology now or surveillance tools use trigger words about protesting and organizing to alert all law enforcement about where a protest will happen before it happens. And that was used against the pro Palestine movement. No group in recent history has been surveilled as much as the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. And with that being said, I don't know if Flock in particular is being used to target protesters by ICE, but with a long history of surveillance being used to target protesters, dissenters, people of color, especially that intersection of when a person of color is a protester or dissenter, there's no good reason to believe that Flock isn't being used to track who's coming and going from protest locations and logging that.
Yeah, I saw a story out of local news in Minnesota, Kara 11, that basically said that in Minnesota, a food shelf director had ICE show up at her residence, and they think it's because some of the shelf's delivery vans are registered in her name. So, there are all these different operations underway. And I think one of the big pieces I'm getting from you, John, is just that these government-owned surveillance cameras can be misused, and there are instances of it across the board. So Flock is the latest iteration that we're seeing, and it's starting to be in conversation here in Madison and in Dane County. I should say Madison already has thousands of stationary and police vehicle and bus mounted cameras that are accessible to police. So being surveilled around Madison isn't new. This is just a latest iteration of that. Madison police have access to those public cameras, and just as many more owned by citizens or businesses, some of which directly register with the police department. So I'm curious what you're thinking, John, but is this just something we have to contend with at this point? It feels like so big. It feels almost out of our hands.
I think there's two things that I would like to talk about. One is why you should care about surveillance, person who believes that they're not committing a crime. And that's why I talked about abortion rights really, really early and gender affirming care. And number two, we can talk about what we can do to fight against surveillance. So Flock's mission statement is basically just says that their job is to stop crime. The problem is that in America historically, crime has not been about justice, but has been about the politics of the time. If you go back to slavery, the original first surveillance law is called the Lantern Law. African slaves were forced to hold a lantern up to their face at night. So white people would be able to recognize who was walking around at all times. It was a way to surveil Black bodies. Escaping bondage in 1776 was a crime. Drinking out the wrong water fountain in 1930s in the South was a crime. Getting an abortion was a crime. Going to a gay bar and dancing with somebody of the same gender was a crime in America. The point that I'm getting at is that we don't know what will be a crime in this country and what will these surveillance tools be used to enforce the law or enforce the status quo. And I think for a lot of Americans, they're like, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. Why should I care about these surveillance systems? I don't have anything to hide. Well, if you go pre-June of 2022, a lot of people didn't have a lot of things to hide before Roe v. Wade fell. Now, Texas law enforcement is using Flock cameras to search nationwide databases to prosecute people who went to other states to have abortions. We don't know under this current administration what will be a crime in 2028, what will be a crime at the end of this year. And Flock's, their mission statement is that they want to fight crime. So what happens when getting gender affirming care becomes a crime? What happens when attending so-and-so protest becomes a crime? What happens when participating in anti-American activities and thoughts becomes a crime? Flock's job is to fight crime. So Flock's job is to use their tools and their power to persecute Americans no matter what, no matter what, I guess, the concept of justice or the concept of crime really falls on. And I think that's the point that like a lot of people need to understand is that surveillance is not a lack of, hey, I trust myself and that's why I shouldn't worry about surveillance. The reason why you should worry about surveillance is because the government has a long track record of ending up on the wrong side of history of its definition of crime, and because you don't trust the government's definition of crime. And that's why I think that people need to care about surveillance technology. Imagine if during COINTELPRO, if J. Edgar Hoover had access to the types of technologies that modern law enforcement has today.
I was just thinking about that era. Yeah, the civil rights.
I was going to say, like, imagine if they could have used flock cameras to track everybody who attended a civil rights march in the South. Or imagine if they could use facial recognition to identify anyone who's a striker during the labor rights movement. Or if they could scan social media posts to find out which women are talking about wanting the right to vote. Imagine the disruption and the terror that law enforcement agencies and the American government could have done on those groups, those people fighting for civil rights and civil liberties that has gotten us to the place we are today if they had the tools of today yesterday. I think that's an important point of grounding of why surveillance matters and why privacy matters is because we all need separation from constant government oversight, and dissent especially requires the ability to organize, meet, and associate without fear that everything you do today will be used against you tomorrow.
It is such a good point. Like, oh, this idea, I'm following the law. This is not something I have to worry about. Well, as you said, laws change. And not only that, we're seeing edicts come out, from the president and the administration. Things are changing and they're not even necessarily following current laws, but saying this is a moment of emergency. Like things can shift. And depending on your behavior and what is being said, you could end up on the wrong side of a situation, as we've seen happen in Minneapolis. Practically speaking, are you thinking about what data should folks take active steps to protect when we're going out in the world?
There's two things that we can do. One, I think websites like Electronic Frontier Front do a really good job of teaching individuals how to fight against surveillance. The problem is that there are sacrifices that are made. So there's this constant conversation and protest movements about what to do with cell phones when you bring them to a protest. I know that this conversation is not about stingrays, but for a quick synopsis for the point of this conversation, stingrays are cell phone tower simulators. So basically, how your phone is in constant conversation with the nearest cell phone tower, a stingray inserts itself in the middle, pretends to be a cell phone tower, and collects that information that normally would go to the cell phone tower. So in protest circles, the conversation is, do you turn your phone off of airplane Bluetooth mode, but still bring it? But some cell site simulators are still able to pick up some data from even phones that are actively on airplane mode. Other people argue, well, what if we just leave our phones at home? But then what do we do in cases of police brutality or police misconduct when cell phones have been such an equalizer when it comes to recording law enforcement misbehavior and posting it online for the world to see? And that's the problems with addressing this on an individual level. And don't get me wrong, addressing these things on an individual level are super important in order to protect yourself. But in the long run, and the wide use of personal technologies and the wide use and powers of surveillance tools, I call them God tools because they basically give you the omnipotence of a God. Individual steps can mitigate harm, but they're not going to do much to protect you. The best thing that we can do is push for CCOPS ordinances at city and state law levels, community control over police surveillance. ACLU National actually helped participate in creating a similar CCOPS framework here in Madison, Wisconsin. But basically, CCOPS does two things. First and foremost, it's not a ban on surveillance. What it does is it brings more voices to the conversation about what surveillance tools are used and what privacy gets violated. Because right now, law enforcement in most cities has the sole power of deciding what surveillance tools they want to be used. And a lot of times, elected officials don't even know what surveillance tools are being used on their constituents. And a lot of times, elected officials don't want to know, because if they know, then they're held accountable and responsible for abuses by these technologies. So basically, what a CCOPS ordinance does is every surveillance technology that is already in use or being proposed to be used has to have a public hearing where the elected officials, whether that's your alder people or whoever runs the local level politics, has to hear law enforcement make a case of why this surveillance tools are needed. And then it allows community members to come in and voice why they, A, want these surveillance technology tools in their communities, or B, why they don't want these surveillance technologies in their communities, or even C, why they're open to hearing more information about why they need these surveillance tools. It gives public feedback. So now, instead of just having law enforcement be the sole decision maker, you have law enforcement, community organizers, groups like us, the ACLU, and everyday people having these conversations about what privacy are we willing to sacrifice for, I'm going to say, in the name of safety. Here at the ACLU, we have a lot of data that backs up that surveillance tools is more the illusion of safety. But for the sake of this conversation about what privacy you're willing to trade in the name of safety.
And as you said, that's something that's happening here in Madison, right? Here in Madison, MPD needs approval from the city council, the mayor, and the IT department. So that is something that's happening here. But, you know, as noted, there are so many cameras that are already in place. So this kind of conversation is just so important. And as more technology develops, and this current conversation around flock cameras, this is so important. If folks do have issue with the use of these cameras, should they be going to their local government, the state? Yeah, where can folks make the biggest impact?
100% hold your local officials' feet to the fire. Madison is really cool because you guys have that accountability mechanism where you can reach out to your mayor, you can reach out to your local representative and say, hey, if you don't address this technology, I'm going to find someone who will, and I'm going to vote for that person to take your job.
Well, before I let you go, do you have any last thoughts you want to leave listeners with?
I do want to really reinforce that while surveillance is powerful, there's more of us everyday regular people than it is of people who want to abuse and misuse this power. And if we really want to stop the bleeding now, we need to get motivated to do something to really fight against surveillance, talk to our elected officials, talk to law enforcement, explain the harm, explain the need for transparency and accountability. And we can hopefully slow this process down and eventually stop it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your insights and this discussion around flock cameras and surveillance. It's been very insightful, and appreciate your energy and making the time to join us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
That's John McCrae Jones, policy analyst for the ACLU of Wisconsin. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm your host, Bianca Martin. Don't forget, you can support the show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Madison neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. And if you enjoyed today's episode, if you found it useful, consider sharing it with a friend who's interested in civic engagement and protecting their rights. Alrighty, we'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take good care and thanks for listening.